The following video is made possible by a generous grant from the Mid-Atlantic United Methodist Foundation, providing stewardship and investment services to faith-based organizations. This is Partnering for Vital Ministries, Courageous Leadership in a Changing World, with Ted Brown and Andy Lunt.
Hi, I'm Andy Lunt. I'm a pastor with some 50 years of experience, and I represent the pastoral perspective in our partnership.
Hi, and I'm Ted Brown, and I have more than 30 years in leadership roles as a layperson in various churches. We want to welcome you to Partnering for Vital Ministries, Courageous Leadership in an Ever-Changing World. And this is our third session. We're going to focus on purpose. And just to refresh your memory, we're journeying together with you to create and grow more disciples and provide more resources for mission and ministry in your church. We're going to help you do that by not only looking at the present state of your church, but also describing the future state. So today we're going to talk about purpose. Now, at the end of the last video, we asked you to collectively answer these questions. What type or types of church are you? And what types of church is God calling you to be? So we're going to take that identity and integrate it with purpose in this particular session. So let's take a look at purpose. The purpose or mission is why we are a church. Now, for all of Christianity, of course, it's the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. And then within each of our denominations, we have a more specific purpose. Each denomination has an opportunity to narrow its focus. And then for the denomination as a whole, within that, there is the local church. And the local church's purpose is even more specific. It's specific to the context. It's specific to the capabilities of the people. It's specific to God's calling for that church. And so its purpose will be similar to and support the denomination and the overall purpose of Christianity as Jesus charged us, but it will be specific. And then once you have that purpose of the local church, then you'll have specific purposes for each ministry within the church and then for each member within the church. And a lot of our focus in this session today will be focusing on the purpose for the local church and for each member. Now, you say, okay, what is a purpose statement? What makes it effective? Well, an effective purpose statement is biblical. And along with this video at our website, you will have the opportunity to have access to multiple Bible verses that will talk about the overall purpose as God has called us through his sacred text. The second one is specific. I've already mentioned that in terms of it being narrow and not necessarily a repetition of the mission statement of the larger body. It needs to be simple and clear. In other words, not a long statement of purpose, but something that each member of the church can understand, each member of the church can relate to, and each member of the church can tell others who are not members, this is why we exist. And then finally, it needs to be measurable. A measurable purpose is one that helps you understand, are you making progress? So a purpose statement needs to fulfill these four criteria. And these criteria come from The Purpose-Driven Church by Rick Warren. So I will listen to this as a reference, and you'll find this a quite useful book in looking at your church's purpose. And for your individual purpose, The Purpose-Driven Life, What on Earth Am I Here For, by Rick Warren is a very useful reference as well. So these purposes are something that, particularly for the individual member, are not necessarily emphasized through time. And we're finding it's more and more important if you're going to have a vital organization that each member has spent time thinking about that purpose and what their life is on this earth.
So last week we talked about identity, but what we discover is that purpose is linked to identity. Put another way, Who we are is related to what we do. So we want to look at some of the aspects of a purpose statement that Ted mentioned. And first, we want to make sure that it's biblical. Last week, we anchored our discussion of identity in the Bible, and we want to do the same today with purpose. So we look to Genesis, for instance, which we read last week, where Abram was told that he would be blessed so that he would be a blessing. And so one of the aspects of a purpose is that it calls us to be a blessing. And then, of course, Ted has referenced the Great Commission, which is over all denominations and all Christians. And in that, Jesus instructs his followers to go and make disciples. And so a part of our purpose needs to be just that, to make disciples. In the letter of 1 Peter in the New Testament, Peter reminds us that we are God's people, that God has called us together and created us as God's people. And as God's people, then, it is part of our purpose and our role to proclaim God's works, in particular, God's mighty acts of salvation in Jesus Christ. And then another biblical reference, to do good works. In Ephesians, which has an awful lot to say about the nature of the church and the purpose for the church as a whole, Paul reminds that we are created by God. The church is not a human institution. It's not a social organization where we all decide to get together because we have common thoughts and ideas or activities. God created it, and God created the church for God's purposes, which is to do good works. So any purpose statement is going to include then at least these four things: being a blessing, not just enjoying God's blessings for ourselves, but sharing them with others; making disciples, making sure that we are reaching out as well as reaching into our own hearts; proclaiming God's works of salvation. That might be called, in the old days, it would have been called evangelism. Today, more it comes in the form of simply sharing our faith. And one of the ways that we do that, although it's not a fully sufficient way, is by doing good works. And then when people ask perhaps why we're doing the good works, we share the story of God's work of salvation and how it has motivated us to do good work. So being a blessing, making disciples, proclaiming God's work of salvation, and doing good works are all part of a purpose. Now, a purpose equals mission. One of the things that we've talked about is that, the purpose is the mission, and it's the reason we do everything that we do. In other words, we look at our purpose statement and we ask the question, is this program or this plan or this ministry or this event a way of fulfilling God's purpose for our congregation? And if it's not, then we might look elsewhere. Now, I have to be frank with you here and say that two things. First, a lot of churches have a purpose or mission statement that is a whole page. And I've been in churches where I'll see it posted on the hallway, on the bulletin boards, or even in the men's room over the urinal, as if that's to help people, keep it in their minds, but it's too long. And so a mission statement, as Ted has said, needs to be brief and to the point, but it also needs to be relevant. And I have to share with you that I've also been in many churches where it appears from what the church does that their mission is to put together, to advertise and conduct an annual ham and oyster dinner, because that drives everything else that happens in the church. In one small church where I went to be the pastor, it was clear from almost the time I arrived that the primary purpose for that church was to conduct an annual auction, because all year long, the activities that went on were centered around getting ready for the auction. Well, those might be nice, fun things to do and help the community, but we need to question whether they are the kind of purpose that we want to be guiding everything that we do in our church. So there are a lot of purpose statements out there, and we've pulled together a number of them to share with you today, simply because they illustrate, I think, the principles that we've talked about. They're biblical, they're simple, they're relevant, and they can be measured. So we'll just go through these quickly. To experience the love of Jesus and give it away. Praising God, growing disciples, and serving the world. God's family pursuing God's kingdom. Reach up reach out and reach in. Revive believers, reach friends, and renew culture. Know Jesus and make Jesus known. Now, what these have in common, besides fulfilling the criteria for what we consider to be a good purpose statement, is they're no longer than 7 words. Church consultant Bill Easom once told me that a good purpose statement should be so simple that even a first grader can remember it. And so these are good examples of what would be a purpose statement that everyone can understand and everyone can remember. Now, a purpose statement is not just meant to be posted on a bulletin board or above the urinal in the men's room. A purpose statement is the reason that for everything that we do. In order to make that really come alive, we want to make sure that purpose statement is a living document. And so some ideas for making it a living document. If it's short, 7 words or less, print it on everything. And I mean everything, on your letterhead, on your bulletin, on anything that gets handed out, on the prayer cards, and wherever you print anything, include the mission statement. Open every meeting with it so that each committee or group that's meeting understands that the reason they're doing what they're doing is to help fulfill the church's purpose. Repeat at the beginning of every worship service. Now, the worship leader, the pastor, whoever opens the worship service can stand up and begin by saying, "Welcome to First United Methodist Church, where our mission is." And you'll know you've reached success when the worship leader founders and the congregation corrects him or her, because that will give you a sense that it has been inculcated and internalized by the congregation. By the same token, I suggest you include it in every telephone greeting so that when someone answers the telephone, they say, "Hi, this is First Church, where our mission is." And then clearly you want to teach it in the confirmation class and make sure that that's part of everything that the children, the youth are learning, and then illustrate how that purpose is being carried out. And a little further down the road, when we're talking in particular about creating a culture of generosity, we'll come back and talk about how important it is at the time of the offering to give an example of how the church's purpose is being realized and say, your giving makes this possible. So these are some thoughts about making the purpose statement a living document.
So in order to help it become more of a living document, we're going to ask you to say, what does your church purpose translate into your own personal purpose? So some of you may have already done that. Some of you, this will be the first time. So what we wanted you to do is to consider or reconsider what your personal life purpose is. Connect it to your church, connect it ultimately to the to Christ's statement to us. So what we would like you to do is write down your thoughts and share them with your small group and just refine them through time. And just remember that you are and were planned for God's pleasure. You were formed for God's family. You were created to become like Christ. You were shaped for serving. Indeed, you were made for a purpose. And so we have some worksheets that you will find at our website that will help you think through this process. And this is one that you won't get the answer right away. It's going to take some prayer. It's going to take some meditation. And it's going to take some asking others to help you think this through. So that's our challenge in your action item for this particular session. For the church as a whole, we'll come back and talk about the church purpose when we talk about context, which will be our next session. So once again, we want to thank you for joining us. And we are very, very interested in your comments and questions and interest areas. So if you'll send those to the address shown here, that will help us decide what subjects we're going to cover in future sessions. And as usual, we want to close with a thought on leadership. This one talks about following the Lord's leading. From Psalms 32, I will instruct you and teach you in the ways you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. So, indeed, for each of us individually and as a corporate community of faith, walking with God requires an intimate, prayer-filled reliance upon Him. You're joining us because you're Christian leaders. So Christian leadership truly is impossible if you haven't prioritized fostering a deep spiritual sensitivity, constantly listening for God's calling for you personally and for your church. So we want to bless you as you are on this journey with us, examining the identity and purpose of yourselves and your church. God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you for joining us.
To access additional key resources, including homework assignments, please register for Partnering for Vital Ministries at the Foundation website shown below. You may also contact us through the website for more information about our stewardship and investment services. This has been a production of the Mid-Atlantic United Methodist Foundation.